Hello, and welcome to this year's final edition of Marketing Brew's virtual event series, the CTA. I'm Minda Smiley, editor of Marketing Brew, and I am so pleased you joined us today. It's been quite the year, to say the least, but 2022 holds promise, and we're excited for the future. Before we begin, I wanted to thank Morning Brew's MBA program for sponsoring today's event. The virtual 8-week program is designed to accelerate the careers of top-performing professionals. Check out more details via the link being shared in the chat. Today, we're reflecting on the last year within our industry while talking about how to best position ourselves for the year ahead. And we get to do that from two very different perspectives. Joining us from Instagram is Patrick Sofin, who serves as Global Product Marketing Manager. And joining us from Mindshare is Sean Clayton, who is an Executive Director and Solution Officer. Welcome, Patrick and Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. So yeah, obviously, like most years in this industry, there's been a ton of trends, issues, problems really arising within the marketing industry this year. And within a half hour, we probably won't get to all of them, but I do hope we can kind of touch on some of the big ones that that are really on marketers' minds this year, and hopefully people in our audience can take away a few nuggets that they can use, as they go back into their own, roles and look at the year ahead. So Patrick, I do want to start off with a pretty broad question around Instagram. I mean, I think the past 2 years really have been really, there's been so much change, obviously, with COVID last year, and the way people were going out to eat changed drastically. They were going out to eat a lot less, which means they were posting photos of their food a lot less on Instagram, traveling a lot less, meaning they were posting a lot fewer travel photos. And obviously we're getting back to normal a little bit this year, but really the effects of last year are going to continue, and it's really just changed the way people live their lives, frankly, and because of that, changed the way they post about their lives. So I'm just kind of curious to hear from you, from a marketing perspective, how are you kind of helping marketers grapple with some of these major changes we're seeing, and how they kind of apply to Instagram, and how, what tools or advice are you providing them with to make sure they're still having the impact they want to have on Instagram, despite the societal shifts we've seen over the past 2 years?
Yeah. So what I would want to dive into is what we're seeing on the commerce front. So if you look at globally how the pandemic has changed consumer behavior, from a macro level, 85% of shoppers are now shopping online worldwide. And then if you want to put an Instagram spin to that, 50% of those on Instagram are shopping on a weekly basis, according to a recent Ipsos study. So what are we doing to better enable businesses to have that shopping experience from discovery to checkout? So with our investment into Instagram Shops and the tools that we're creating to drive traffic, I think it's exciting to see the engagement that we've seen across Instagram and Facebook to better enable businesses to have that full experience. So just for a little bit of context, we're seeing 300 million shoppers across Facebook and Instagram on a monthly basis, and 1.2 million businesses have already begun to set up their shop. Within the US, currently, we are also offering checkout to all businesses, which is allowing businesses to actually have their products checked out within the app without ever having to leave. So this digital storefront that we've now created is really replacing what I think was previously done as window shopping. And that's an exciting new trend that I think will only continue to accelerate. And what we're trying to do is make sure that businesses are set up for success, and doing so not only with their shops, but also offering advertising opportunities to drive ads with product tags and branded content ads with product tags to have better drive that traffic.
Okay. And as you're kind of helping marketers shift to these, making some of these changes and making use of these digital storefronts and shops, so to speak, what are some of the major roadblocks they're kind of running into as they do this, and how are you helping them with that?
Yeah, shopping can have a lot of different friction points, and we're trying to make that opportunity as seamless as possible by actually partnering with some of the e-commerce partners like Shopify, so that it makes it easier to actually set that up. Additionally, we're also trying to look at it from like three different audiences of shoppers, sellers, and creators. And the better that we're able to connect the dots between the three of those, the better experience we're going to create for the Instagram community. So as we continue to really ensure that seamless discovery from and serendipitous discovery of a product, and then all the way to checkout, making that as easy as possible for businesses.
Okay. And Sean, moving over to you, like we just said, the past few years have been nuts. They've really changed a lot in terms of how marketers approach their audiences. From your perspective, from the more media perspective, what are some of the biggest shifts you've kind of seen in terms of how it's affecting media mixes, media planning, media buying, and as we go into the new year, what are some of the major things you're advising clients to do to kind of grapple with these changes?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to start kind of where you ended around how we're advising clients and some of the things that we've seen historically over this past year. So, you think about everybody was advertising for a very long time around rational data signals. And what I mean by that is that a rational data signal is kind of this granular demographic behavioral breakdown. So as you see me, you see, XYZ-year-old, Black African-American person that lives wherever, right? And oftentimes when we would go and build lookalikes off of that, there would be lookalike trends that would be either based on some aspect of behavior and based off aspects of the demographics. Well, I mean, if you take another 42-year-old, I'm saying my age now, Black male that does similar things, we might have completely different motivations. And that empathetic layer that lives underneath each one of us, which we call our subconscious, has been, we would consider not very codifiable over time. One of the things that, we at Mindshare and a lot of other agencies that I've actually started to see move into is understanding that empathetic layer and what it really means to really dig down into the emotional drivers, into the motivations, into the actual feelings that individuals lean into so that you can start leaning into those feelings and emotions that are now starting to be tied into the media construct. If you start thinking about what people watch and they view and the media channels that they actually engage with, many of those are a lot of fear-based channels. And so if you move into a fear-based channel to then start buying media against those, then you can only expect fear-based outcomes because there's kind of a reflective reality that sits on the other side of that. So as we're advising our clients within more of our good growth story around what Mindshare is standing for more recently, and overall, I think humanity is just kind of waking up to this thing around we want to feel more love, more abundance. And in that space of doing so, and brands wanting to then lean into that, you can then say, okay, how can I align my brand with kind of like the Simon Sinek golden circle of my brand why? Lean that into more of that emotional codification that sits underneath that subconscious layer that individuals are starting to really understand more about the reality of themselves. And then through that, start to match the media opportunities with this codifiable different dimension of media and audience activation and start to take that down the path of accelerating this new white space that we're starting to find is very interesting around subconscious targeting. And not subconscious and like we're going to hypnotize you, but more so just really understand like, hey, there's a feeling and an emotion that you feel. That feeling and emotion is tied back to a lot of past memory. That past memory has actually kept you into this cycle of habit. And then that habit, if you're a brand that wants you to buy, from the brand or start to engage with the brand, what we really want to make sure that we start doing is aligning how can we actually move you either into building more of that habit or breaking that habit to start experiencing something new. And aligning that within the media constructs, whether it's across social buying, whether it's across, understanding where that paid search starts to capture or catch that actual demand, whether it's really leaning into big screen activations across, linear television buying, which, everybody's saying it's going away, which of course it is going away because the addressability is changing. But how can we move addressability into that big screen format to where we start thinking around, connected television, getting behind the paywalls, working with, brands and different programs and the actual creators that sit on the other side of that to then start placing those products or placing those brands in a very authentic way that starts to change the experience of the media environment. So one of the things that I feel like we're going to start seeing, and a lot of my colleagues feel the same, and I know we've heard meta kind of going around everywhere, no pun, Patrick, but, really starting to understand what that metaversal alignment starts to mean, how we're starting to lean into these different experiences as IRL or in real life is starting to merge with the digital landscape and the convergence of those two sides really start to adapt differently and finding that empathetic layer that lives underneath it because the awareness that's taking place in that space is really going to start bringing consumers into a different understanding of self. And that understanding of self is now going to start translating into the way we purchase and buy media, and even creative starts to apply to it. So it's going to be a really interesting 2022. But as we start positioning ourselves, the landscape is going to get broader, but the white space is going to be, I feel like, something we've never seen before as far as addressability and media buying.
Okay. I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago. I think you said fear-based channels lead to fear-based outcomes. Can you maybe give me an example of like what that even looks like, and also how marketers can maybe move away from that if that is an issue?
So it's probably hard to move away from it, but it's just more so gaining awareness about it, right? So channels meaning, I mean, if you think about the news, I mean, we had a really tough 2021, right? I mean, I think you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing something about COVID. And of course, being aware that COVID exists is fantastic, because we want to know kind of where we're stepping off and, how things are starting to change so we could feel more confidence as a society. But on the other side of it, if we're constantly being inundated with some aspect of fear that takes us away from really the love that created us as a humanity, then in essence, we have to start questioning if I'm always looking at that and viewing that. And, those channels that I'm leaning into, which, news is not a bad thing, because we need to be aware of what's happening in our ecosystem. But if we are consistently starting to change our behaviors to be more fear-based and, react to that fear, start to make decisions out of that fear, and no longer start to create out of the opportunity of abundance and love, then, I mean, you can only imagine what the output's going to be on the other side. So as brands, one of the things that we try to challenge the brands that we work with is that, hey, of course, yeah, you want to advertise in the news because, there's some things that are happening there and a lot of people are engaged because it's very addressable. But on the other side, when you start, you talk about the brand safety type of things and whatnot, you start tying your brand to that only thing, then people are going to associate bad news with what you stand for. And if they do that on an ongoing basis, or even in some of the social platforms, there's a lot of insecurity that takes place. I mean, people that, chase their exes around and look at things that they don't have and live in the state of lack. And some of that's awesome because, you can share your success. And that's kind of like, hey, there's great things that are happening. But how we start to frame that when really we go through the process of placing media in a very focused fashion allows us to make sure that we're doing it for the good of the brand and what the brand really stands for. So oftentimes one of the exercises that we go through is when we sit down with brands, like, what does your brand really stand for? What is the why behind that? If you were to leave a legacy tomorrow, how would you want to be remembered? And in that space of understanding the memory that's tied to the brand itself, and we start thinking about the channels that we're going into, do those channels align with it? And when they do align with it, great. And even when they don't align with it, is there a way that we can start adapting the creative to make sure that that creative aligns more to pulling people into the space that your brand stands for, instead of the space that the actual channel potentially is starting to pull the mind state into?
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of saying you're trying to almost provide alternatives for some of the main ways that advertisers have reached people for quite some time. And I think kind of going off of that a little bit, I did want to touch on the end of the third-party cookie. I think we've been hearing about the cookie dying for years now. And now, as we learned this year, Google is extending the amount of time that people have with the cookie, I guess you could say. So I wanted to get your thoughts, Sean, around, I think we've heard a lot about, the fact that it is going away, but we're also getting to the point now where marketers have been testing solutions or testing other ways of just even reaching people. Some of it is still kind of based in targeting, contextual advertising, maybe, or gaining first party data. But I'm also curious, just more broadly, as we kind of move away from this, something that we've just relied on for so long as an industry to reach people, how are you kind of helping some clients think through some of the bigger changes around, like how can you use media to reach people in a customized way that without some of the tools we've historically just really kind of leaned on?
Yeah, great question. So Signal's not going anywhere. The way that we codify the identity is going to go somewhere, which actually to me is one of the more exciting things, because it's really going to allow consumers to put themselves back in the driver's seat. One of the, if you go a little deep into the Web3 ecosystem, and I'm not going to go down that path because we could spend all day on that, but if you go down that, one of the things that's happening is the, enablement of consumer consent associated with it. And there's been a lot of different areas to where, there's been historically a daisy chaining of that consumer consent that's being drafted into these identity graphs that live very third party that you can lean into in order to understand how to continue to target individuals very one-to-one. One of the things that we're doing is starting to break brands out of like these hyper segmented, really, really granular cohorts that live across it. And what we kind of view the world as right now is there's 4 primary cohorts, and it kind of lives within, the audiences that you know and audiences that you don't know. Okay. If you understand the audiences that you know and the audiences that you don't know, then you can build out a resonance framework that allows you to understand, well, I've got high resonance audiences that resonate well with my brands and my content and everything else that I stand for. I have low resonance audiences that don't, right? And then you can put those in a bucket. You have third party audiences that you don't know that do the same thing. And when you look at those different areas and opportunities, then it's less about making sure that I get this really hyper granular segmentation and more in the space of, tying it back to a identity graph, and I think graphs are going to kind of start moving into more chain-based solutions with, that's a whole other set of conversations. But, as we start moving into identity graphs that brands start to go through the process of owning and leaning into and then building a lot of their first party data construct and doing it in a way that's exchangeable for the content that they have and enabling the power of the creators to then enable that content back to the brands themselves, then it starts to really foundationalize and seize up what we would consider as a loss of identity into an understanding of identity that's actually being built from a consent-driven side versus actually somebody saying, hey, I'm just going to start grabbing all this data from individuals and building an understanding of these audiences very third-party wise. The accuracy starts to change, the engagement starts to change, the addressability starts to change, and that's really where you start to see the upside. So we've been really helping clients work through, foundationalizing that graph from a first-party data ownership. And then there's ways that we go about that around, creation of content, putting the consumers at the middle of the actual journey itself. And then through that process, then it starts to adapt into a net new solution. But to me, the death of the cookie is one of the most exciting things because it takes what I consider is kind of the laziness out of it. And it really puts marketing back into the driver's seat of being able to market the way that is touching the hearts and minds of consumers.
Okay. And Patrick, I want to pop back over to you. And I want to talk about something that I know a lot of marketers have been experimenting with over the past few years, but especially this year, and that's short-term video. Obviously, TikTok has really blown up, taken off over the past few years. Instagram came out with Reels, which is basically its answer to TikTok. So I wanted to ask, I believe it was this year that Reels kind of came out with an advertised, Reels ads, basically, which marketers can use. I wanted to ask about sort of how, as this becomes a bigger and bigger trend, how you're helping marketers use Reels in a way that is effective. And if you could provide like a few examples, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the rise of short form video is something that we are certainly invested in here at Instagram, and investing into video is not a new thing for Instagram. As you look across video experiences on Instagram, you have stories, which is kind of like your diary, your behind the scenes content. You have Instagram Live, which is your kind of real time connection with community. And now with Reels, it's connecting interests through entertainment. And with Reels ads just being 6 months into market, we're really just scratching the surface in terms of how we're continuing to guide advertisers, and are just now publishing our first external case studies. So, but how do we actually provide guidance to what is essentially a new form of medium to advertisers? So as just from a creative standpoint, we're looking at it from really a 3-pronged solution in terms of, is the content that you're making relatable? Is this something that your audience can relate with? Is it attainable? Is it something that they could do? And is it recognizable? Is this part of a social trend? Is this part of a dance that they've seen? It's these types of like small creative tips and tricks that we're continuing to provide. And then as we look at it at Reels from an experience across Instagram and Facebook, this is something that advertisers will want to better understand, as Reels has launched organically within the US and is now beginning testing as well on Facebook. But as you think about Instagram and how do we now provide advertisers with the guidance as to how they should be adding it into their marketing mix, we are currently in the midst of building proof points to help advertisers better understand that. And it's really exciting to see, I would say, in terms of why people should believe in Reels, because it's currently the largest contributor to engagement growth on Instagram. And it's also the best place to reach people who don't follow you. So because it's a part of this unconnected experience, it's really a chance for brands to help tell their story in a more meaningful way.
Okay, fair. And I know we're kind of coming up on already only 10 minutes left at this point. But I do have a few more topics I want to touch on before we move over to audience questions. And I think another huge topic we've seen this year, and Sean, you touched on this a little bit already, talking about the cookie, is just this trend of consumer privacy. Obviously, we've seen Meta make changes this year regarding privacy. Just more broadly, I think consumers are becoming, people are just becoming more aware of how advertisers use data, and I think they're becoming more concerned, and they want to know that that they want to have more transparency regarding how advertisers use some of this stuff. So I guess my bigger question for both of you really is, as privacy just becomes something that marketers have to think about, what are some ways that you're, Patrick, that you're working with marketers, or Sean, that you're working with clients, where you're kind of helping them almost think in this new way about how to reach people in a way that doesn't really feel like you're violating, information that they might have or anything like that. I'm just curious to know from a broader perspective what these conversations kind of look like.
Patrick, you want to go first?
So one thing I'll say about privacy, and that often gets overlooked, is that Instagram is going to continue to put consumer privacy controls at the highest priority. And whether I'm talking to a friend, you can go into the Instagram app at this current moment and click into settings and click into privacy. And those controls are at your fingertips. And there's a myriad of them, from the ads that you want to see, to whether or not you want to show like counts, to the data that you want to share. So that's really at the forefront in terms of like how we want to ensure with consumers that we are prioritizing this. Then as we look at campaign performance, we're also going to continue to evolve with this advertising ecosystem and ensure that we're doing everything we can to provide the right tools and guidance, and doing so on a regular basis, so that driving conversions is still an utmost focus and priority for the company. So in short, I would say privacy is going and ensuring that consumers have that utmost control is the top priority.
Yeah.
Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I could diatribe if you want me to, but realistically, I always kind of equate it to, like almost like the car buying 20, 30 years ago. I mean, for a while, nobody knew what a car cost. You would go in and do these games that, the dealers would do with you. And then it came, TrueCar and all these other things that came out, and then understanding like kind of the way that the supply chain was built. Really kind of the opportunity around privacy has to do with historically supply chain issues and the way that it was actually built out. As consumers put themselves into the driver's seat of controlling that supply chain, is what I call it, then you're in a position to be able to then throttle privacy. As we move more into Web3 adoption, the consumer is going to be at the middle of everything at that point. And so privacy is going to really take a big turn. I think this evolution of moving from third-party cookies to trying to continue to draft that consent in a different type of way. And then once this more Web3 adoption starts to hit, everything is going to change kind of overnight. And so the more that we position ourselves as brands to be able to understand what that looks like, and give the consumer the opportunity to really understand how privacy works, create an education system tied to it, so that at which point, they can turn things off and on and receive differently, starts to make all the changes. And short term, of course, there's context-based alignment, channel-based alignment, and really why we've started to help clients move into more of this, feeling and emotive-based, like neuro kind of targeting. That in itself starts to go deeper within this 95% subconscious that's easily targetable across a very few sets of emotions, that makes it easy for us to then align creative and context and addressability to it, versus kind of this other way of targeting individuals, which was to me overly hyper segmented, and that allowed for very small lifts with a lot of effort, but looked really cool when you would talk to somebody about it. It's like, I could target, the one person that lives in this apartment doing that thing. But I feel like that should have changed a long time ago, and now it's just forcibly doing so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've covered a lot. And before we kind of move to audience questions, I do want to ask each of you, what is one trend this year that you think was overlooked, and what is one trend that you think was overhyped? We'll start with you, Patrick.
All right. So in terms of an overlooked trend, I'll keep it quick in terms of, I'd say creator monetization is something that is a company priority for us in ensuring that we're creating the right tools and practices so that creators can make a livelihood on Instagram. And we're doing so in a couple of different ways. One, by actually putting money in their actual pocket. We're investing over $1 billion by the end of 2022 through a number of different programs, including production of Reels content back into the pockets of creators. Then secondly, we're also introducing a number of different tools on Instagram that actually enable creators and businesses to have easier conversations and to reduce friction there. And then third, as I think about how are we actually guiding businesses and educating them to better understand why they should be working with creators, we've been issuing branded content guidance to actually make sure that advertisers understand why they should be working with advertisers. In terms of an overhyped trend, I think one trend we're still learning about is on the social audio front. Instagram is a visual first platform, but it is a trend that Facebook has participated in. And I think it's one that, as the pandemic hopefully comes to a close sooner than later, it's one that we will continue to learn how businesses will eventually use that to create a meaningful connection with their customers.
All right, yeah. Sean.
On my side, I think that Web3 overlooked. We're now really stepping into it, but if you're not considering it as part of your brand or as a marketer or a way that you're adopting, you're way behind. So there's opportunities there that I think was overlooked, and people are starting to clamor after it now. And then overhyped. I'm probably going to get kicked for this one, but really the death of the cookie was a little bit overhyped because there's a big reset on that one. And we went a little crazy at the beginning of the year and then trying to figure it out, but it's not, it was a little overhyped in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I know we've definitely talked about it a lot for sure in this industry. And so our first audience question comes from Adriana, and she asked, any thoughts on the job market landscape of today and new ways to market to new talent? It's more of an internal question, really. Either of you can jump in if you have any thoughts.
We're not jumping into this one too fast. Go ahead,
I'm taking a lot of different calls about wanting to work at Meta. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give to anyone is that do your homework, show your passion, and know your why for that company. And whether that's listening to earnings calls or it involves like understanding the mission, the leadership, and what that company really believes in. A part of that brand purpose, which I'd say is also a marketing trend right now, understanding that, believing in it, and really getting to understand the products and using them.
Yeah. And I think everything is moving from individualism to community. And as we start thinking about more what those communities start to look like within the constructs of hiring, not only, everybody can fit into the ecosystem, but really understanding, what their superpower is when they are interviewing, them being aware of that superpower themselves and not trying to, I'm a big fear love guy. You'll find this in a lot of things that I talk about, but, not wanting to hire out of somebody out of the fear of not having, and the person not wanting to actually go through the process of finding a job of the fear of not gaining. And I think if you go into those spaces, then all of a sudden what happens when the person does come on board, it changes things, significantly. The marketing messages that we tend to put out there really should be more built around sustainability and ESG and things along those lines, and then how we manage against that versus it being, kind of a historical way of marketing, especially as this we're getting on the other side of COVID and this different way of viewing the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think we have time for one more question from Dylan, who asked, is there an efficient way to distribute content on multiple platforms without copying and pasting the same post across all outlets?
So I can only speak to the content that's distributed on our platform, but making bespoke creative is always going to be your best bet in terms of making sure that the content is authentic and native to where it is actually living. And I can't hammer that home enough in terms of wanting to see the best performance on each specific platform.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it shouldn't always be rinse and repeat for everything, because all of the platforms have their own different, feeling and resonance and how people engage with them. And so if you do the same thing, then you're going to have diminishing success over time, when it comes down to more of a copy and paste methodology.
Sure. Well, Patrick and Sean, that's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on the industry.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Patrick and Sean for speaking with me today, and to all of you who joined us. I'd like to thank Morning Brew's MBA program for making this event possible. We'd love to hear any feedback you have about today's program. We'll be sharing a brief survey in the chat and via email in the coming days. Look out for our 2022 event plans, which will be announced in the coming months. We hope to see you there, but now we'll see you in our newsletter. Happy holidays to all.